When Lacey Tremaine gave birth to her baby daughter, she knew she couldn't tell the father, Greek billionaire John Drakos. She wouldn't give him a chance to reject her baby the way he once rejected their relationship as nothing more than a mind-blowing affair. But now, John has discovered her greatest secret. And as Lacey soon learns, he's intent on doing anything in his power and using every sensual skill at his disposal to show her that their family does belong together. Surprise Baby for the Greek Tycoon is a special introduction to Jenny Lucas's new trilogy, which starts with The Secret, The Italian Claims on Sale, June 1st, 2018, only on harlequin.com. Buy from other retailers, starting July 1st, 2018. When Lacey Tremaine was a little girl, her mother always said, "If you're feeling sad, do something nice for someone else. You may not feel better, but somebody else surely will." So when Lacey found herself unexpectedly pregnant, dumped by her lover returning home to New York City, she'd allowed herself one night to sob under a quilt. Then at dawn, she'd realized she couldn't be the only single mother feeling heartbroken and scared. So she'd wiped her eyes, picked herself up from the bottom of the ice cream carton, and done this. Now, Lacey looked around the community center basement with pride. When she'd started this New York single mothers group over a year ago, 5 women had showed up for the first meeting. Now there were nearly 50 weekly attendees. Looking at women of all ages talking earnestly to each other, Lacey thought Mama was right. It made her feel good to help others feel better, especially since her own heart was still broken. All Lacey had to do was look at her 6-month-old baby to feel the blow of what she'd lost every single day. Because Taffy's dark eyes were exactly like her billionaire father's. "Thanks for the cookies, Lacey." She turned to see a plump, tired-looking redhead holding up a paper plate. She smiled. "No problem, Tess. I mean it." The other woman's tiny, sleeping newborn snuggled in a baby carrier against her chest made Lacey's 6-month-old daughter seem huge by comparison. "You're a lifesaver. I'm glad you like them." "Like I've eaten 10 of them just to stay awake." The redhead yawned. "I don't know how you manage it, Lacey. Running your own business while raising a baby on your own. You're superhuman." Lacey's cheeks went hot. Thanks. "I wish I could be strong like you." The redhead sighed, then hurried back to her friends at the refreshment table. Lacey watched as Tess whispered to dark-haired Hallie Hatfield, who had her own tiny newborn, and blonde, scowling Lola Price, who looked hot and miserable in an advanced state of pregnancy. The 3 friends who'd met at the group months before looked at Lacey with admiration. She wondered what they'd say if they knew the truth. Lacey looked down at her baby in the stroller. Taffy was dressed in a lightweight romper appropriate for the warm evening in early June, leaving her adorably fat legs bare. Babbling, her baby looked up at her smiling with those dark eyes. Lacey's heart lifted to her throat. John's eyes. Her hands tightened on her glass of non-alcoholic red punch. Since she'd left Athens 14 months ago, pregnant and alone, she'd tried to forget him. But hot dreams of him still tormented her at night. "Stop it," Lacey told herself furiously. Having finished her drink, she set the plastic cup down on the nearby table. "It's over. You'll never see him again." But even as she was thinking the words, a strange trickle of awareness went down her spine. Heat flashed across her body beneath her white cotton sundress. Lacey looked up, and her breath caught. There, standing inside the doorway of the community center basement, was her ex-lover. The man she'd once loved. The man she now hated. The man who had no idea she'd had his baby. Except looking at the dark scowl on John Drakos' face, it seemed he'd just found out. John Drakos's black eyes narrowed as he slowly looked over the crowd in the community center basement. He saw women of all ages, young and old. But where was the one he'd just traveled 5,000 miles to see? He rolled back his tight shoulders beneath his tailored jacket. If the rumor he'd heard was true, it can't be, John told himself harshly. And yet, because of that rumor, he'd left Athens in the middle of a hostile takeover to find the woman who'd wrecked his peace of mind for the last year. Lacey. When he saw her, a shock pulsed through his body. Lacey Tremaine was even more beautiful than he remembered, with her long dark hair, creamy coffee skin, and luminous brown eyes. So desirable, so alluring, so dangerous. Narrowing his eyes, he went forward, barely noticing the startled eyes or whispers of the other women as he passed through the crowd. He was intent only on her. When John reached her, he stopped. He looked down at her, towering over her, with his much greater height, standing close enough to breathe in the scent of her shampoo wildflowers and vanilla, a scent his body remembered well. Against his will, memories flashed through him of hot days and nights. In New York, in Athens, at his family's villa on his private Greek island. He remembered Lacey smiling up at him in the hot, steamy shower as he washed her hair. Her brown eyes glowing with longing and need as he ran his hands over her naked, soapy body, his fingers sliding sensually over her slick skin. Pushing the memory away savagely, he looked at his ex-lover. Now, Lacey's expression was guarded. He thought he saw a glimmer of fear in her eyes, quickly replaced by anger as she lifted her chin. "What are you doing here, John?" He heard a slight tremor in her voice. Her eyes narrowed as she glared at him. "How did you even find me? Your neighbor." For a moment, he felt dizzy being this close to her, hearing her voice. There was a reason he'd avoided Lacey Tremaine, even the mention of her, for the last year. It hadn't been easy, but every man had his weakness, and John Drakos was looking straight at his. When she'd left him in Athens 14 months before ending their passionate, months-long affair, he'd been shocked, almost bewildered. He'd sent her flowers and messages and done everything he could to win her back. But against her stony silence, his pride had eventually rebelled. He'd never tried so hard to win any woman. He'd told himself he was better off without her. Now, looking at her beautiful face, hearing her voice and breath, all he wanted to do was take her in his arms. Then he saw, tucked carefully behind her, almost as if she were trying to hide it, a baby stroller. He heard a baby's soft babble. He felt a rush of emotion that almost made him stagger. His eyes narrowed. Is the rumor true? Lacey John's voice was low, dangerous. Did you have my baby? Lacey clasped her trembling hands as she scrambled to think of a good lie. But there was no point. He knew her too well. As she knew him, that was the problem. 2 years ago, John Drakos had hired her firm, Lacey Tremaine Interiors, to redecorate his Manhattan townhouse. The Greek billionaire had insisted on having Lacey herself do the designs, rather than one of the 3 other interior designers. Lacey hadn't minded. Having the Greek Tycoon as a client was a PR coup, and their design meetings had gone well, too well. Within weeks, she and John had become lovers. Their affair was only supposed to be a brief amusement, but weeks of pleasure turned into months. Passion became unexpectedly more. They were so alike, both independent, ambitious, and cynical about love. John had lazily confided that he didn't intend to marry until he was at least 40, whenever he was ready to have children, when he'd settle down with some suitably old-fashioned wife from a good Greek family. That had suited Lacey fine, because she never intended to marry anyone. Why pledge her life to some man who would only disappoint her? Better to depend only on herself. But as she'd finished work on his Manhattan townhouse and moved to Athens to redesign his penthouse there, her feelings had started to change. They took weekend jaunts to his private Greek island. They made love under the stars and shared whispered confidences and laughter, along with bottles of wine. Raised in different worlds, they somehow saw the world the same way. Going to bed with him every night, waking up in his arms, she realized she'd never been so happy. And one morning, Lacey realized she loved him. Simple as that. She loved him and wanted to marry him. Before she could even wrap her head around that, the next day, she found out she was pregnant. After that, she could no longer be silent. Consequences be damned. That afternoon, naked in his arms in the bedroom of his villa, with the hot sun on her skin, she'd looked at him and breathed. "Why don't we get married?" He'd been holding her naked against his body. One of his hands cupped lazily over her breast, relaxed and content with sheets still twisted around their ankles from their passionate lovemaking. But at her question, he'd drawn back to look at her, his dark eyes troubled. Then his sensual lips twisted. "Would that mean a design discount? I mean it." Her heart was beating fast. Looking up at him, she whispered, "I love you." John stared at her in shock, and Lacey held her breath. He was going to tell her he loved her, she thought in desperate hope, and that he wanted to marry her. Then, and only then, she'd tell him she was pregnant. That way, there'd never be any doubt they'd married for love. Then he snorted. "I'm flattered, Agape Mu," he drawled. "But you would make a terrible wife, and I'm not ready to be a father." A terrible wife, not ready to be a father. Her mouth had gone dry as ash. "John, don't ruin what we have." "What do we have?" she said hollowly. Lowering his head, he nuzzled her neck as he whispered, "Pure pleasure." But to his shock, she'd pushed him away, gotten up from the bed, returned to New York, ignored all his calls, and tossed the flowers he sent to her office straight into the trash. Since then, Lacey hadn't once considered telling John about the baby or asking him for help. He didn't love her, he didn't want to marry her, and he definitely didn't want a child. She was on her own. But now, looking up at the cold fury in his eyes, Lacey realized her mistake. "Answer me!" John's fierce, dark eyes seemed to cut through her soul. "Did you have my baby?" She wanted to lie, to deny it. But as she looked up into John's black eyes, exactly like her beloved daughter's, there was only one word she could say. "Yes," she whispered. John reeled at the word. Standing in the community center, surrounded by strangers, he staggered beneath the weight of the news. Lacey'd had his baby. He was a father, and he had been for months. He just hadn't known it. She'd purposefully kept it from him. "How could you not tell me?" he said hoarsely. "You made it clear you didn't want me." Lacey glanced behind her at the stroller and then lifted her chin defiantly. "So I thought you wouldn't want her." The baby was a girl. He had a daughter. One he hadn't known about. An ache lifted to his throat of anger and pain and loss. "You thought wrong," he ground out. He nodded to the red stroller. "Is this her?" "Yes." He knelt abruptly in front of the sweet, chubby baby. Feeling a sense of vertigo, he said gruffly, "Hi." The baby looked up, puzzling at him with black eyes exactly like his own. And the last of John's uncertainty fled. He didn't even need a paternity test. There was no question this child was his. The baby had a plump face and short, wispy dark curls. Her cotton shorts showed fat, dimpled legs as her bare feet stuck out of the stroller. "What's her name?" he asked thickly. Taffy, Lacey said behind him. Taffy Drakos, he tried out. She paused. Taffy Tremaine. John whirled to look at her, shocked at the fresh betrayal. She hadn't even given his child his surname, as if she were ashamed of the proud, ancient name of Drakos. Or maybe he thought grimly so she could try to keep his daughter's secret from him forever. Had Lacey hated him so much? Just for turning down her irrational proposal, which she'd blurted out without apparent thought 14 months before. For that, she'd been willing to punish him beyond imagining both him and their child. Cold fury filled him. She'd done this, all of this. Turning away from her, he looked at the baby, keeping his voice gentle. Hello, Taffy. I'm your father. The baby frowned, and then unexpectedly burst into a wide smile, as dazzling as sunshine, showing 4 tiny teeth, like pearls in her pink gums. And that was all it took. John's heart exploded, expanding bigger than his chest. He'd heard this phenomenon could happen for new parents, but he'd never believed it. His own wealthy, distant parents certainly had never treated John with any particular affection, but he already loved this child. He'd just met her, and he knew he would die for her. You said you weren't ready to be a father, Lacey whispered beside him. He looked up at her grimly. She was pale, her dark ponytail swaying over her graceful neck and bare shoulders above her white cotton sundress. What was I supposed to do? He rose to his full height. Tell me the truth, he said coldly. Not lie to me for a year. Her cheeks burned red, and she dropped her gaze. John looked down at her breathtakingly beautiful face, his eyes tracing unwillingly over her warm skin, the generous curves beneath her sundress. His body stirred. Even now, he realized he wanted her. In spite of his pride, in spite of her deceit, he still wanted her. His jaw clenched, and he hated her for that most of all. Lacey had felt dizzy watching as John knelt in front of the stroller, speaking softly to their baby. His tone was gentle, protective kind, loving, but John had spoken to Lacey that way once too. She caught her breath when he rose to his feet, towering over her, broad-shouldered and sleek. As always, he was dressed for business. He'd probably come directly here from some cutthroat acquisition or merger for his billion-dollar global conglomerate. That was what John did best. Conquer. We should go, he said coldly now. Lacey licked her lips. Go! He glanced around them grimly. We've entertained your friends for long enough, don't you think? For the first time, Lacey noticed the other women in the community hall basement were watching them avidly, though. As she looked up, they pretended they were only interested in their cookies and punch. If any other father had suddenly shown up at the single mother support group, Lacey had to admit she would have been keenly interested too. She glanced at Hallie, Tess, and Lola by the folding chairs. Those 3 hadn't told their exes about their babies either. But then Lacey reflected they must have their reasons, just as she'd had hers. She glared at John. I'm not going anywhere with you. Narrowing his eyes, John glanced down at their baby in the stroller. You owe me that much. I don't owe you anything. You took my child, Lacey. His voice was low. You never even gave me a chance to love her. Are you really so selfish that you'd put your own pride above Taffy's right to have a father? Staring up at him, Lacey sucked in her breath. Was that what she'd done? For the last year, she'd believed steadfastly she'd done the right thing. John didn't love her. He didn't want to marry her. He didn't want a child. But what if that had just been her hurt pride talking? Sometimes you've got to put salt on your humble pie and eat it, her mother had often said. She'd also said, family isn't just the most important thing. It's everything. Her mother, Delia, had had good reasons for that belief. Lacey's father had left before she was born, just as Delia's own father had many years before. But growing up in their warm, comfortable home in Rockaway Beach, with 3 generations of Tremaine women living under one roof, Lacey had always felt loved. But as a child, she'd sometimes wondered about her father. Why he'd left. Why he'd never come back. "I'm sorry," baby Delia said sadly whenever Lacey asked. "He was charming, but unreliable. He just didn't want to be a daddy." Lacey took a deep breath. Her mother would have been horrified that she'd kept Taffy away from her father. As John had said, she'd never even given him a chance. Trembling, she looked up at his coldly accusing eyes. If he truly could love Taffy and be a devoted part of her life forever, could she truly be selfish enough to refuse? She couldn't, no matter what it cost her. "All right," she said in a low voice. "All right," John demanded. Lacey lifted her eyes to his, feeling wretched. Being close to him, forced to look at his darkly handsome face and hear his husky voice when she knew he didn't love her, nearly killed her. But she did it. For Taffy. "I'll come with you," she whispered. The June sun had set streaks of red crossing the darkening sky as they arrived at the Campagna Hotel in New York. John couldn't stop looking at Taffy as he pushed the stroller into the elegant, high-ceilinged lobby. The baby had fallen asleep in his chauffeured Rolls-Royce on the drive to Midtown. Every time he looked at his daughter, his heart twisted in his chest. Especially when he thought of all the time he'd already missed all the months she hadn't had a father to love and protect her. His hands tightened on the stroller handle. "Never again." "Slow down," Lacey said, struggling to keep up. "Are you trying to outrun me?" Gritting his teeth, John slowed the pace of his long stride so that Lacey, who was almost a foot shorter, could keep up as they got into the elevator. Looking down at her ethereal beauty, he hated her, almost as much as she'd apparently hated him to punish him this way. All for turning her down when she demanded marriage on a stupid whim. Of course he'd refused, with good cause. Marriage wasn't to be taken lightly. It was about family. It was called settling down for a reason. He couldn't marry Lacey. They were too much alike, ambitious and selfish. He needed a sweet, simple girl of good family who would focus on caring for their children and home. They'd have a sensible, enduring marriage, exactly the opposite of what his own parents had had. John's father, Vasilis Drakos, had divorced his first wife when his mistress Dimitra had become pregnant with John. By all accounts, his parents' love affair had been scorching and thrilling, but their marriage had been doomed from the start. Perhaps they'd once loved each other, but by the time John was 5, the relationship had dissipated to cutting remarks and avoiding each other, and also avoiding their son, whom they left to indifferent servants. The only one who truly cared for John, ironically, was Lacey Drakos, his father's first wife. The childless woman, discarded by his father, had been kind to him as a boy. She'd listened to John's troubles, sent care packages and letters to his boarding school and gifts for his birthday. Feeling disloyal, John had often wished she could have been his mother instead of the coldly glamorous, absent Dimitra. And he'd known when he grew up he'd marry someone like Lacey, a woman who was kind and warm, not some woman who thrilled and dazzled him. Because thrills faded, magic died. And his romance with Lacey had been all about magic and thrills. Like him, she'd had no desire to settle down. Equally ambitious in their careers, she in her New York design business, he in the international conglomerate he'd inherited from his father. They'd both worked hard and played harder, traveling the world on his private jet, enjoying fine meals at Michelin-starred restaurants and attending formal galas that ended as everything did with hot sex. Then out of the blue, she'd asked him to marry her. He'd been astounded. So he'd told Lacey the truth she'd make a terrible wife. And as thanks for his honesty, she disappeared from his life. Now, as the elevator door slid open, John glanced at her coldly. He opened the door to the hotel's penthouse and motioned Lacey into the luxurious suite. She walked ahead of him, and his gaze unwillingly traced her curves. He hadn't been able to forget her. In spite of her sudden, irrational decision to propose. Except Lacey was never irrational, he thought suddenly, about anything, or destructively vengeful. She must have had a reason. John sucked in his breath. "You knew you were pregnant," he said hoarsely. He looked at her in his hotel suite. "I thought it was a whim. But you already knew about the baby, didn't you? That's why you proposed." Lacey slowly turned. Behind her, the New York skyline sparkled in the night through the wall of windows. She looked at him. "No." Her dark eyes were luminous in the shadowy penthouse. "I proposed for a different reason." "Why did you propose?" "Then," John said coldly. A lump lifted to Lacey's throat. "I told you," she whispered. "I proposed to you because I loved you." His handsome face looked shocked and then furious. It might have been amusing if the situation hadn't caused Lacey so much anguish and heartbreak. John parked the stroller with the sleeping baby and grimly came toward her. "You have a strange notion of love," he bit out, "leaving without explanation, stealing my child, keeping her secret for a year. I thought it was for the best, for you, for all of us." John stopped just inches away from her in the shadowy penthouse lit only by moonlight. His powerful body towered over her broad-shouldered and muscular in his sleek suit, and she shivered. All her hot dreams of him for the past year came disturbingly close to the surface as she felt the heat emanating from his skin. She breathed in his scent, sandalwood and musk, and something distinctly him. Her traitorous body trembled, wondering what it would feel like if he took her in his strong arms. If he kissed her. If he did more than kiss her. Shivering, Lacey looked away. Desperate to create a distance between them, she turned, looking around the suite. "So, this is the penthouse suite of the Campagna. I can see why you'd stay here." "I sold the townhouse." "Yes, I heard." She ignored the pang in her heart, recalling all the hours she'd spent redecorating his Upper East Side townhouse where they'd first fallen. No, not into love. She couldn't say that, but at least fallen into bed. So much pleasure and lazy laughter and delight. All turned into ash. Lacey tried to smile to make polite conversation when she felt sick inside. What would John do now that he knew about Taffy? "It's a lovely hotel," she stammered, hardly aware of what she was saying. "My company is actually co-sponsoring a charity ball here tomorrow with the owner." "I didn't bring you here for small talk," he said flatly, looking ruthless and fierce. His rigid jaw dark with 5 o'clock shadow, his eyes black as night. "I return to Athens tomorrow. I'm in the middle of a hostile takeover." "You're leaving New York," she breathed. His jaw twitched as he gave a hard nod. Relief went through Lacey so great she almost cried. Because she knew how ruthless John could be, especially when his pride was at stake. But in spite of all his fine words about wanting to be Taffy's father, he was leaving. The thing she'd most dreaded that he'd find out about their daughter had happened. But it wasn't going to change their lives, after all. Lacey would be able to keep the life she had with Taffy, which if it wasn't entirely happy, it at least wasn't sad. It had taken her so long to get over John. She still wasn't completely over him if she was honest. Her greatest fear was a custody battle, but even if that hadn't happened, having John around on a daily basis, wanting him part of her still loving him, would have been more painful than she could endure. But John was going back to Athens tomorrow. She exhaled, trying to hide her relief. Oh, that's a pity. Yes, for you. His eyes glittered. Because you're coming with me. The color drained out of Lacey's cheeks. What are you talking about? I'm not going to Athens. Of course you are. John glared at her. What's my other option? Leave her here with you. She bit her lip. I thought. His jaw tightened. He knew exactly what she'd thought. You thought I'd leave my child, like my parents left me. A shadow passed over her face. During their weekends at his Greek villa, she'd asked about his childhood once, and he'd laughed off his loneliness as a boy, trying to make it a joke, an amusing story. But Lacey hadn't been fooled then or now. Imagining he saw sudden pity in her eyes, he savagely wished he'd never told her. You're right, she said slowly. She ran a hand over her forehead. I should have known. You'll never leave her. Her voice was flat, strained, as if being forced to share their baby to travel to Athens on his private jet and be close to John again was some kind of death sentence. I proposed because I loved you, she'd said. He felt another twist of pain inside his chest. He remembered how he'd felt when she'd asked him to marry her last year. For one split second, he'd been thrilled. It had been like Christmas and his birthday at once. Then he'd remembered how it would inevitably end, and he'd forced himself to be coldly rational, refusing her proposal he hadn't intended to end their love affair. Not yet. He'd hoped to spend more time with her. Months, years perhaps, but she'd tossed him aside so easily, without a second glance. John looked at her in the dark penthouse suite. Her haunted face was lit by the glow of opalescent moonlight from the windows. Do you still hate me so much? He said in a low voice. She looked up. Hate you. I can see it in your face, Lacey. I can hear it in your voice. Perhaps you loved me once, but now you wish I was 10,000 miles away. Her expression changed as her white teeth nibbled worriedly against the tender skin of her bottom lip. Such a small movement, and yet it caused a pulse of heat through him, a prickle of sweat forming against the hard muscles of his body. His body suddenly reminded him that since she'd left, he'd taken no other mistress to his bed. Being chased had been a new and profoundly unpleasant experience, one he hadn't experienced since he was a teenager. He'd had opportunities, of course, but he hadn't wanted to. He'd only hungered for the woman he couldn't have. And now she was finally within reach. Was it any wonder his whole being was pounding with need? I don't hate you, she said slowly, and I don't regret that you found out. Because you're right, Taffy needs a father. Then Lacey's beautiful face crumpled. But what will I do? You'll come live with me, he said harshly. Athens. She shook her head hard. My life is here. My company is here. You'll give that up. I'll provide for you both. Lacey looked at him in shock and then gave a harsh laugh. Oh, right. Give up my company. Fire all my employees and tell my hard-won clients to take a hike. Leave my friends and my home. And for what? So I can be your kept woman in Greece, isolated and alone like a princess in a tower. Staring down at her, John knew he was in for a hard fight, one he might not win unless he played dirty. A sudden idea trickled through John's brain and then exploded with powerful force. Why hadn't he seen it before? He'd always known he couldn't be stupid enough to marry for passion. He'd planned to marry some sweet, simple, old-fashioned girl in a sensible union. But fate had swept those plans aside. He had a daughter. Taffy's security and happiness now meant more to him than his own. And since Lacey was the center of Taffy's world, she also had to be the center of his. If John wanted to give his daughter his name and a stable, permanent home, he had to do the same for Lacey. He had to marry her. John's gaze fell from Lacey's luminous brown eyes to her full, sensual lips, to her warm, creamy coffee skin and her generous curves beneath her white cotton sundress. And there would be other benefits to marriage. His hands tightened. He could have Lacey in his bed. Now. Forever. "Not my kept woman," John said huskily, his dark eyes piercing hers. "You're going to be my wife." His wife, Lacey sucked in her breath. Once she'd dreamed about becoming Mrs. John Drakos. But that was when she'd loved him, when she'd actually thought he might love her back. But now, "You once said I'd make a terrible wife," she said in a small voice. "What's changed?" John's eyes glittered in the moonlight shining through the windows of the penthouse suite. "You know what?" She looked toward their sweet, plump-cheeked baby sleeping peacefully in her stroller. "Taffy, she deserves my name. She deserves a stable home and 2 parents." He paused. "So we'll marry." And that was his idea of a proposal, she thought bitterly. He didn't even try to pretend he actually cared about Lacey. He just wanted to possess her, to secure her as an accessory to their baby, in the same way he might buy a crib or hire a nanny. Drawing a shaking breath, Lacey shook her head. "Thanks, but no thanks." His cruel, sensual lips curved. "You weren't always so reluctant to marry me, and you made me pay for it," she said coldly. "I would understand you wanting to marry me when you discovered you were pregnant." His dark eyes glinted. "Why won't you admit that's the reason? Why do you cling to what is obviously not true, that you loved me?" Lacey swallowed. She wondered what he'd say if he knew her final, humiliating secret that she'd never stopped yearning for him. If he knew he could crush her completely. Clinging to her self-respect, she lifted her chin. "You once said that love was a fairy tale and only idiots married for passion." His jaw tightened as if he saw through her evasion. "But he said only, what I might have believed in the past is immaterial. Only Taffy matters now. I've already missed 6 months of her life. I don't intend to miss another day." Looking down at Lacey, he added huskily, "Or another night." Beneath his dark gaze, a flash of unwilling heat went through her body. Could he mean? No, he couldn't still desire her. She was sure he'd forgotten her the moment she'd left his bed. All right, so he'd called and sent flowers after she'd left him. But that wasn't because he truly wanted her, she told herself fiercely. He'd probably just never had a woman leave him in his life. John Drakos just couldn't bear to lose. "No, I've had a lot of time to think about it, and you were right." She took a deep breath. "Marriage between us would be a disaster. I can't be the type of woman you want." She lifted her chin. "And you can't be the man I want either." John moved closer to her, towering over her, his body inches from hers. "If you say you don't still want me, Lacey," he said softly, searching her gaze, "you're lying." His gaze fell to her mouth, and a current of electricity went through her body. Her lips tingled with anticipation, her nipples tightening. Involuntarily, she started to sway toward him. Then she straightened, clenching her hands at her sides to keep from reaching for him. "You're right. I do want you," she said in a small voice. She looked up at him fiercely. "But I'll never marry you." This wasn't how John had ever imagined proposing marriage standing in the middle of a hotel room. his clothes still wrinkled from his flight from Athens with a baby sleeping nearby, and worst of all, no diamond engagement ring to slide onto her finger. But Lacey wouldn't care about the ring. She was no gold digger. In this, she was different from any other woman he'd dated. She didn't need his fortune. She was building her own. And she was raising Taffy without his help. She had money, friends, a home. She didn't need John at all. It was a sudden and disquieting thought. "Have there been other men for you?" he said abruptly. "Since me?" She set her jaw, and for a moment he thought she might refuse to answer. Then she said grudgingly, "No." A rush of relief went through him, a panacea to his pride. "Nor for me," he said quietly. Lacey's eyes went wide. "No," she whispered. "You're lying." "I've never lied to you." Slowly, he pulled her into his arms. He felt her tremble as his hands ran down her back against the soft cotton fabric of her dress. "I never stopped wanting you, Lacey. Not all this time. I couldn't touch another woman. I've only wanted you." Her eyes went wide. "But that doesn't mean marriage," she stammered. "There's no reason to marry. We can share custody." "Marriage," he said firmly. She took a deep breath. "But I only want to marry a man I love," she whispered. "A man who loves me." "There are different kinds of love." Reaching out his hand, he stroked down her dark ponytail, down her neck. "I made you happy once." Caressing her bare shoulder, he whispered, "I can make you happy again." As he felt her shiver beneath his touch, his blood was pounding through his body with the need to take her, to claim her as his own. In his bed, as his bride, with his name. He wanted to possess her now and forever. Just the thought caused a surge of desire so great, he barely kept himself under control. All he wanted to do was press her up against the wall of the hotel suite, to plunder her juicy lips, to ravish the length of her throat with kisses. He wanted to touch and stroke her all over, to feel the soft curves of her body. He wanted to rip the cotton sundress off her and— "But an affair is different from marriage," Lacey said desperately. "You always said so. You said love was the worst possible reason to marry." "No problem," he said hoarsely. "You don't love me anymore, and I don't love you." She swallowed, her cheek slightly pale. "So give me a reason why I'd ever be your wife." Reaching out, he cupped her cheek. "There's a very good reason." "What?" "This!" And he roughly lowered his mouth to hers.